Good afternoon, Dr. Amit. Good afternoon, Professor Ingrid. Good afternoon, Dr. Balakrishnan. Good afternoon, Dr. Schneider. It's my pleasure to give the welcome remarks. The STP Forum has been organizing these lectures for more than 5 years now, and this is the 47th lecture. Even if we discount those COVID years, we have been doing it every month after month and then bringing various speakers across disciplines, across countries to discuss matters of national and international importance. And today's talk is going to be on data sovereignty and data governance. Both are very crucial, particularly in the context of India's G20 presidency, and more importantly, the way the global debates on data sovereignty, data governance, data localization, or cross-border data flows, these are very closely linked. At the same time, very controversial, very hot also. And we cannot find a better speaker than Professor Schneider to speak on this topic, because she has been an experienced scholar who has been researching on this for quite a couple of years and has also been traveling, doing a lot of field work. And I should also proudly say that she is part of the Prodigies Network project with which we are also working. So like everyone else, I'm also eagerly awaiting to hear her thoughts, share her thoughts on that. Over to Dr. Balakrishnan. Thank you.
Over to you, Mr. Tandon, for your remarks.
Well, I only want to say that I'm really delighted on behalf of the India Habitat Center that this series has been kept going by the enthusiastic participation of so many of our institutions, particularly RIS in this instance. And this collaborative venture has been very useful over the last few years. And I'm so delighted that it has been kept going virtually also once the lockdowns started worldwide. And the fact that this is the 47th lecture in just about 5 years or so, I think it's a little less than 5 years since it started.
Perhaps more than 5 years.
It's more than 5 years. All right, time flies. So it's a wonderful tribute to the enthusiasm with which this series has been taken up by everybody, and also the reception that it has received. I believe that some of the lectures have also been published by RIS, and that is again a very, very laudable endeavor. Thank you very much, and I'm delighted that we have Dr. Ingrid Schneider delivering this particular lecture on an extremely important subject, digital sovereignty and data governance, which has certainly exercised our government for a long time and many governments across the world. With that, I would like to say that I'm looking forward to hearing this lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Tandon, for your remarks. So let me welcome all of you this afternoon to this lecture. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Dr. Ingrid Schneider as our main speaker today. She is a professor of political science in the Department of Informatics at the University of Hamburg, Germany. Her research fields are technology assessment, governance, law, economy, and ethics of IT, on which she has published numerous papers. Since 1996, she has advised several institutions, including the European Parliament and the European Commission, and has acted as a board member of various European scientific associations and research projects. The current research projects are on digitalization in emerging powers in Europe and on ethical, legal, and social aspects of AI. She has more than 100 publications under her credit. I'm glad to say that she has been a visiting researcher at the RIS, New Delhi, and she has also been a visiting researcher and professor at various institutions in Brazil, Mexico, and Austria. So I'm sure we'll have extremely important and deep insights from her remarks. Just to set the remarks, a few remarks to set the context. As was pointed out, this is the 47th STIP lecture. We started in September 2017. We are trying to bring focus on key developments in science, technology, and innovation to the general public through these lectures. Since we have gone online, we have had much wider participation, including from participants from abroad, which has been very heartening. Today's lecture is on digital sovereignty and data governance in times of geopolitical rivalry. We are living in a world that is increasingly getting digitalized in almost every aspect, from personal identification, finance, health, commerce. The impact of digitalization has been profound. Huge volumes of data are being generated as billions of people become integrated into a system involving mobile smartphones, computers, and the internet. These advances have generated certain challenges that we must address. Personal data is information that relates to an identified or identifiable individual. Businesses as well as government entities process personal data for delivery of goods and services. Processing of personal data allows understanding preferences of individuals, which may be useful for customization, targeted marketing, and developing recommendations. Processing of personal data may also aid law enforcement. However, unchecked processing may have adverse implications for the privacy of individuals, which has been recognized as a fundamental right. It may subject individuals to harm, such as financial loss, loss of reputation, and profiling. Privacy and management of personal data has become a major issue. It requires informed consent of the individuals and also for what purposes it can be used. As mentioned, personal data and preferences can be used for marketing purposes and for influencing opinions, including during elections. A major issue is to what extent can national security considerations override privacy in personal data protection. The right of individuals to remove elements of personal data they consider as harmful is also being recognized. The explosive growth of social media and the internet has empowered individuals to express opinions in ways that were unprecedented. This has given rise to the need for regulating in a sensible way the content that can be put on social media, especially when it comes to preventing hatred, terrorism, and social disruption. Growing dependence of societies on digital infrastructure and tools has increased vulnerabilities to cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and cyber attacks in cases of conflict situations. The fact that cybercrime and cyber attacks can be launched from far-off places, making the attribution difficult, is an additional complication. Proceeding against cyber criminals who operate across many jurisdictions is a complex process. We have seen many cases where science and technology developments far outrun the ability of policymakers to cope with them. Often, policymakers are behind the learning curve when it comes to science and technology. As a result, policymaking and legislation in the area of science and technology and its impact on society tends to be reactive. This gap is even more serious in the case of developing countries. The latter find themselves reacting to developments and new emerging international arrangements, which may neglect their concerns. This is a gap that science diplomacy must bridge. Another gap which needs bridging is one between those with legal and ethical expertise and the technical practitioners and developers of digital technology. Digital space and digital data flows are inherently global and they transcend national boundaries. Hence, there is a need for global consensus on governance of digital space and data flows in the interest of all of us and indeed the industry. However, the prevailing situation of global tension and conflict does not help in achieving consensus on meeting many global challenges, including those in the digital arena. Either we must end the conflicts or find a means to deal with global challenges that is not a hostage to the parties in conflict. Coming to India, we have made great advances in the use of digital technology for development in areas such as financial inclusion, health and vaccine management, e-commerce, e-governance, etc. Digital India now includes an enormous universe of some 1.2 billion users with mobile phones, despite the low level of digital literacy. It generates a huge volume of data that is extremely useful to many users. However, this raises the need for a robust and efficient architecture to manage security and privacy concerns. India is making its efforts to evolve a framework for digital sovereignty and data governance. We have enacted the IT Act of 2000 to regulate the usage of personal data, but there is no standalone law on data protection. In 2018, a committee of experts chaired by Justice Sri Krishna examined issues relating to data protection. Based on this committee's work, the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019 was introduced in the Lok Sabha. The bill was referred to a joint parliamentary committee, which submitted a report in December 2021. In August 2022, the bill was withdrawn from Parliament And in November 2022, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology released the draft Digital Personal Data Protection Bill 2022 for public feedback. It is hoped that the bill will now take on board all the concerns of the stakeholders and will result in a system that further promotes the growth of the digital economy in India and its linkages with the global digital economy. I will encourage all those interested to go through the bill carefully and comment on it. I am sure that today's lecture will help us to better understand the complex and evolving trends in governance of digital space and data. Over to you, Dr. Schneider. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this fabulous introduction, and I feel very pleased and honored and delighted to be part of this famous lecture series. So let me first share my slides. Should be here. Okay. And can you see the slides?
Yeah, we are able to see.
Wonderful. Yeah. My research here in Delhi is part of a project which is called Prodigies, Promoting Research on Digitalization in Emerging Powers and Europe Towards Sustainable Development, which is a project, a staff exchange project. So I'm here in Delhi for 3 months. And other countries involved are European countries, but also Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and India. You can learn more about it on our website. And the aims of Prodigies are that we want to have a process of transnational knowledge sharing at the intersection of digitalization and sustainability to better understand how positive effects of digitalization can be achieved and negative effects be mitigated. And we also want to engage in multi-stakeholder dialogues and trainings to shape technological trajectories and to promote a positive and policy paths that are more likely to maximize the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the structure of my talk today is first I will introduce some first remarks about the changes and shifts in the internet governance, then also talk about the political economy of digital platforms, and third, the state's responses to platform powers, and the issues I will tackle in these responses are data protection policies, competition policy, data governance policies, and the regulation of the use of artificial intelligence. So let me start with a first look back. So some 25 years ago, the internet was seen as a borderless open cyberspace. And there was even a declaration, a very famous declaration at the Davos conference that declared the internet as something apart from the real world, from the analog world, and that the states would have no power over this cyberspace. Another narrative was that the internet superhighway will bring the world closer together and the digital divide will be bridged. So I think the question is, what has happened within the last 2 decades? How has not only the internet changed, but also our understanding of it? And how can we conceptualize the interactions between citizens, states, and corporations? Today, there's a lot of talk about competitive races in the digital realm. Most pronounce the race in technology and in digital power between China and the Western countries, more pronounced between China and the US. So there is a lot of rivalry which is expressed in digital technologies, but also in software platforms, in forms of spreading the own technology in other geographies of the world. And there's a new term which emerged in the last 3 or 4 years, which is the term digital sovereignty, also data sovereignty and strategic autonomy, which are reclaimed vis-à-vis large power in asymmetries in the digital realm. So when we talk about digital sovereignty, we talk, for one, about the relationship between citizens and the state in terms of protecting the privacy of citizens. But we also talk about the relationship between the state and the big tech companies in questions of who is having the power to regulate and who can sanction or restrict powers. Let me have a look back at the data. Every form of usage of the internet creates large amounts of data, which are stored in data farms, data centers, which look like this. So it's large server farms. And even if you use cloud technology, the data is not stored in the sky, but it's stored in real places. And these places are subjected to the jurisdiction of the nation state where these data centers are located. Another part of the internet is submarine cables. And also, of course, we need the digital infrastructures, cell phone towers, communication networks, and also cloud services. The digital divide is not something which has been bridged. There is a large part of the population within countries, but also between countries, which does not yet have access to the internet, and this is getting to their disadvantage more and more. And new technologies are advancing in terms of machine learning, artificial intelligence, which also calls for large amounts of data. So there's an increased demand, increased hunger for data. And there are new developments very much discussed with ChatGPT, for instance. So the internet and the digital are now almost everywhere. There is no separation anymore between the analog and the digital world. The internet has become commodified and commercialized, and it has become a space for power asymmetries due to political economic processes. So I want to go a little bit deeper into the political economy of those digital platforms. Big data is said to be the new oil. And the metaphor of the platform is used very often to describe these power arrangements. So the characteristics of digital platforms are that they enable two or more sides to interact, for instance, customers, advertisers, and service providers, and they produce network effects. This means that the more users you have, the more valuable is the platform becoming for everyone else. And those platforms often use cross-subsidization, so you get a service for free as a customer, but this is financed by ads. So the other arm of this platform is creating revenues to make up for the costs of providing the services for free. So the rules of service and product development are set by the platform owner. And Nick Srinicek, whom I cite here, who has written a book on platform economics, says that in that respect, platforms embody a politics, as they do not only gain access to data, but also control and governance over the rules of the game. And I think this is very important. So, as already said, platforms act as intermediaries between different sides, and the terms of use are determined by those who own them. Very often, these business models aim first at very high market shares, and their revenue models also rely on tracking the online activity of the users. So, the value chains from data analytics become a source of power for large platforms, and network effects and other effects often lead to the oligopolization or even monopolization of those digital companies. And this is a graph which tries to express a little bit the power asymmetries. When you look at the market capitalization, which is the stock value of those platforms, you see that most of these platforms are concentrated in the United States and in China, and the other geographic areas are very much underrepresented. And you may know the term GAFA or GAFAM, which relates to the largest Western platforms, US platforms, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. And in China, we also have large platforms, which are the so-called BAT group. It's Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. What are the sources of the power of those platforms? Of course, one of the sources is that they are able to extract largest amounts of data of consumers, of companies, and they are the most valuable corporations in the world in these days. Their value is more worth than $1 trillion US. And Facebook or Meta dominates the social media sector because Facebook acquired WhatsApp and also Instagram. And the user base of those platforms is larger than the population of any nation state on our planet. The largest growth rates of Meta are in Asia. And the concentration of power is also expressed in the internet traffic. The big tech services take up more than half of the total network traffic in the year 2021. So to sum a little bit up, the sources, main sources of the power of those platforms is that they have the highest market share, they can scale very quickly, they have an enormous market value and the largest user base. They can acquire potential rivals so that they do not get really a challenge to their power. And they can dominate digital markets. They create high revenues. They pay little taxes. And they become monopolies in certain sectors. So they gain a lot of economic and also political power to set the rules of the game. These rules are set by business models and technical designs. They can also lobby politicians and litigate strategically. And when it comes to the power in terms of content moderation, we can also see that they have acquired an enormous information power. And this power is played out both vis-à-vis individual users and also vis-à-vis whole nation states. So the question has come up, who is ruling? Is it the platforms or is it the states? And many scholars also have written articles that the platforms have become de facto regulators because they exercise a quasi-law making power by their business models and by their technology. These platforms use lots of data for tracking, for pattern recognition, and for profiling the users. And this is something which is often very little known. And every user, so as those data can be aggregated, these platforms have kind of a data shadow which is laid over the individual user, so they can predict some forms, and these data profiling practices can be used to meet the preferences of the users in terms of advertising, music, entertainment, interests, and to identify needs and provide adequate information. But it can also be used to exploit vulnerabilities, also for price differentiation issues. They can be used to disinform and to manipulate the users. And this has been used also for political manipulation. So the promise was that our privacy is taken seriously. But if you can see, adding a comma means that the reality is really that very often the privacy is not respected, but abused. So what are the responses of states to this enormous platform power? I want to go into some details of regulation which are proposed or passed. Very often, I think many nations feel squeezed between the digital models of the US, which is a very libertarian model, and China, which is a relatively authoritarian model, both with respect to inside of the country where the social credit system is being exercised, a lot of surveillance and control, but also with respect to the digital Silk Road, which also spreads Chinese influence in other countries. The UNCTAD Digital Economy Report has reported a great concentration in value creation capture in the digital economy, and that China and the United States are the front runners in harnessing the value of data. And in Europe, a former French economy minister said, we don't want to be a digital colony of the US internet giants. What's at stake is our sovereignty itself. So many countries, European countries, but also Asian countries, are searching for a so-called third way vis-à-vis the US and China's models. In that respect, India has also proposed a data location strategy. And civil society also insists on the fundamental right of privacy and wants informational self-determination control about who has which data about yourself. So what are the regulation policies? I think the biggest achievement was the data protection policy in Europe, with General Data Protection Regulation, which dates back to 2018. And it's seen internationally as a gold standard. The GDPR is based on two fundamental rights, the right to privacy and right to data protection, which are both codified in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And there are some principles like the informed consent, data minimization, purpose limitation, and other principles. GDPR has also codified a right to be forgotten and the right to data portability. And it has enhanced the powers of the data protection authorities. One of the main reasons for the success is also that the data protection authorities can impose very high sanctions. It hasn't happened so far, but there is at least the threat that sanctions can come up to 4% of the total worldwide annual turnover. And this is something which even CEOs have to take in serious. If we compare the data protection regimes between the EU, US, and China, you can see that Europe is the most stringent data protection regime. And the GDPR is not only valid within Europe, but has also codified the so-called market location principle, which means that data protection law applies to companies which are based outside the European Union, but have products or services offered in the European market. And in that respect, also the GDPR has extraterritorial effect because the GDPR principles are enshrined into international trade agreements. So both these principles and articles protect the privacy of the European Union citizens, but the effect goes beyond because the GDPR has become an international standard-setting instrument. So there's a famous book called The Brussels Effect, which says that the European Union has very high standards and by different regulations and different mechanisms has extended and expanded those standards to the rest of the world, because for the companies, it doesn't make sense to really separate their business models with respect to the European Union and to other states. So they will set the same standards everywhere else, And to comply with GDPR, they will set very high standards. So in that respect, the GDPR is often seen as something which has achieved a race to the top in terms of privacy standards. So the European Union portrays itself as a regulatory superpower. And if you look at the law in the books, at least, this has been a large success story because in last year, more than 142 countries have passed general data protection legislation. Also, China has passed a data privacy law. And India, as Dr. Balakrishnan has already mentioned, also has a process of passing a data protection bill. In India, in the Puttaswamy judgment by the Supreme Court, privacy was considered and protected as a fundamental right. And there was a longer process in the history of different versions of such a personal data protection bill. And the new bill was presented in November of last year and open for public comments, and is expected to be introduced in the Parliament in the budget session of this year, which means March or April. So in India, the terminology is a bit different than in other countries. The citizens are considered as data principals. They have the right to access, correct, and delete their data, and the organizations processing the data are called data fiduciaries. They have the obligation to data minimization, purpose limitation, and some storage limitation. So there are some parallels or some commonalities with GDPR, but the draft as proposed does not have a collection limitation. There's no concept of a sensitive personal data like biometric data, for instance. There is also a concept of deemed consent introduced, which is a little bit a blurring concept because informed consent is not in that respect respected as strong as, for instance, in GDPR. And there will be no independent data protection authority, but a data protection board, which is assigned by the government. Interestingly, the data localization clause in the former proposals were withdrawn. Instead, the Indian government will provide for a notification of countries to which India's citizens' data can flow. The term is trusted geographies, and there may possibly be a blacklist or a whitelist of friendly states and unfriendly states. What many human rights and digital rights organizations and also lawyers have criticized is that there are strong exemptions for allowing governmental access to personal data due to interests of sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, or the maintenance of public order. These are very, very general clauses. So the question is whether the state is also responsible for the privacy of its citizens or may infringe the privacy of its citizens. There are many clauses which have the term as may be described. So there's a quote, "This bill leaves a lot of power in the hands of the government to notify rules that may change the legislation." India also plans to set up a complementary bill, which is the bill for non-personal data. And for this non-personal data governance, there was an expert report also, which issued a report and also had a revised report drafted and published. And in February of last year, the MeitY also released a draft India data accessibility and usage policy. So you've got one framework for personal data and another one for non-personal data. but yet also the question, what is non-personal data when it comes to the anonymization of data, is still something which needs more discussion, I think, or has already received a lot of discussion. So the next form of trying to rein in the powers of the large big tech platforms is competition policy. And the question is, has been thrown up in many states. The US in the Biden administration has started to struggle about possible means of breaking the power of big tech. The Federal Trade Commission has expanded its powers, and there are a number of lawsuits which may have even the result that some of those companies might be broken up. We will see what's going to happen. Europe also has taken on the tech giants in terms of competition law. There were several very, very high fines in 3 Google cases in Europe. And Europe has also passed 2 very important acts, which is the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And those acts try to cut off the big data dragnets and provide access for SMEs on the one hand. And they also want to anticipate certain laws and certain regulations, because it has been shown that competition law inquiries need a very long time. The proceedings take lots of resources as well. So the purpose of these Digital Service and Digital Markets Act is to have an ex-ante regulation, especially of digital gatekeepers and very large online platforms. China as well has taken measures to compete, to restrict the power of those bad platforms. And there were many anti-monopoly laws which were passed recently. And also companies were forced to tighten their controls over personal information. And in India, I have learned there have also been 2 Google cases in terms of antitrust policies, and high fines were also imposed on Google in October of last year. So there seems to be some commonalities in this field as well. Another field are the data governance policies. In India, you have identified and planned and also implemented the world's largest biometric system. And this Aadhaar system is also becoming a basis for new business models. So I have learned about India digital payment systems, which are very successful, especially the UPI system is used even by street vendors in the informal sector. And there is the India stack, which builds on Aadhaar, but there are other systems which are built upon it, different layers. And you have also implemented the so-called data, the DEPA, the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, for enabling data sharing in terms of consent management. And last week, I attended a workshop on the Data Management Office, which is planned to be set up. And I think this is a further step in really engaging in new forms of data governance in India. Similar steps have been taken by the European Data Governance Act, which I already mentioned. This act aims at facilitating data sharing, both by public bodies, but also by private companies and individual citizens. It aims at so-called European data spaces in different sectors, and the first legislation which was proposed concerns the European health data space. This has not been passed. It's still in the phase of a draft legislation. All these data governance acts propose a form of either mandatory or voluntary data sharing to enable the value of data value chains be created not only by big tech companies, but also by smaller and medium enterprises. So this is a form to really enable another form of ecosystem for data. And last but not least, there is a regulation of the use of artificial intelligence. And as you may know, there are many, more than 100 AI ethics guidelines which have been published by public actors, by expert groups, but also by private actors. And there are some similar design principles for AI on which there is something like the international consensus. For instance, in Europe, there have been ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which were drafted by a high-level group of experts. And Europe has also made an effort to have a risk-based approach to regulation of artificial intelligence. So there will be some applications and usages with minimal or no risk, which will be permitted. Other, which medium or high risk, will be permitted, but also be subjected to certain requirements in terms of transparency obligations, conformity assessments, and there is a list of unacceptable risks which will be prohibited. So the UNESCO has also implemented some AI principles, and India, as I have learned, has also implemented a national strategy for artificial intelligence, a report which was published in 2018. And there are additional documents in terms of principles for responsible AI. So India's AI policy aspires to enable India to become a world leader in AI, to use AI for economic growth, social development, and inclusive growth, and become a model for developing countries. The focus is on 5 sectors, and 7 principles are recommended. And in these reports, there is mentioning of some possible harms, but in all, the positive impact of AI is very much emphasized. And as I think, the bias and risks may be a little bit downplayed. So to conclude, I think there are many commonalities in the strategies to tame the powers of big tech companies, but there are also different narratives and different value orientations. In the United States, control of data lies within the private sector, and the expansion strategy to increase control of data is through private digital corporations. China is very tight in terms of control of data by the government and wants to expand its reach by the digital Silk Road, and the European Union wants to control data, data being controlled by individuals based on values, and wants to expand its strategy by regulatory leadership and partnerships. So in response to large private platform powers, states have developed several counter strategies. Just to remind you again, it's first data protection laws, second competition law, several data governance initiatives, and AI ethics principles. There are some convergences in terms of the names, but I think if you go more into the detail, you also see there are quite a lot of divergences. What will be the effect of those strategies? I think converging can mean a more harmonized international system, but the downside might also be that the internet may become fragmented into different spheres of influence. And at the current stage, I can think and see that digital geopolitics is on the rise. But to show you this little graph again, I think states are very much oriented towards competing with each other towards harnessing the power of digitalization and datafication for innovation, but also for social welfare of its citizens. And citizens want their privacy to be protected and other fundamental rights as well. So sometimes there might be some conflicts arising between the power of the state also to release or get access to data of citizens and the privacy of citizens. And I think we should also be aware of techno-solutionism, because the digital revolution is certainly something which has advanced lots of technologies, but problems have to be tackled also by social and other means, and not only, we shouldn't believe that the digitalization, digital transformation will solve all the problems we can identify. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward now to your questions. You are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Schneider, for your very detailed and informative presentation. And I'm sure the participants have digested or are digesting many of the things there. Well, let me look at the chat box. So far, there is one participant who has intervened here, and I will read out what he has said. He is Ashish Gosain. So he says, thanks, Dr. Ingrid, for your insightful presentation. Given the discomfort of Europe with regard to the market dominance of US and Chinese companies expressed through its various judgments on competition and the trend of fragmentation of domain name policy at Internet Governance Forum, ICANN, what do you think the future is for human rights approaches to privacy in comparison to current approaches on Internet of Things? Does the narrative change in every digital technology not reflective of regulatory capacity issues more than convergence obtained geopolitically and or through market? I must say they have used very long sentences. One of the things is that use short and clear sentences to express what you're asking. So there it is. It is in the chat box. Professor Schneider, if you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, I might shortly respond. I think it's not only a power struggle between states and digital companies, but also a question of digital of civil society organizations to reclaim privacy. So I think in many countries, digital organizations have reclaimed their rights. There are digital lawsuits. There is a lot of tension, but also I think the Supreme Courts play a very large role in really defending fundamental rights of citizens. And in Europe, I didn't mention there is another act which is called the Data Act, which tries also to regulate the Internet of Things and also releasing of non-personal data, which is exchanged in the Internet of Things. So I think we can see some convergences, but it's also a question of power and measuring of power and of fighting certain powers. At least if those powers infringe privacy and also may become harmful to citizens. So yeah, this could be and should be my short answer.
Thank you, Professor Schneider. There is another comment which has come in from Mr. Hemant. He says, a great presentation. And then he asks what India should do to become a data superpower. Sort of rather simplistic question, but you could give your response as you see it.
I mean, I have been in India for 2 weeks right now, and I heard that India has very high aspirations to become a digital superpower, to become a digital giant. And I think India has a large user base, of course, and I found the idea of really using Indian citizens' data for the sake and for the purposes defined by India is a very good approach. But data is also something which needs to flow. So I think the architecture of certain systems, like the India stack and other systems, are interesting approaches which might help India to become a data superpower. But we should also not forget that the world is not only about data, but also about physical things. So I think internet access has to be given to all Indians. So far, it's only half of the Indian population which is really connected with the internet. And I think India has also to strengthen its regulations, because I think, for instance, the Digital Personal Data Act has been watered down from one draft to the next one. And I think the rights of citizens should also be respected and should also be implemented in those acts. So I leave it by that, so that other questions can also still be expressed.
Okay. Well, let me see. Yes, here is a question from my good friend Jesudas Bell. He says, just a minute. Nice to have you on board, Jesudas. I'm glad you joined. He says, very informative. Can big platforms be happy with metadata rather than individual data? Can their business survive that way?
Yeah, thanks. Interesting questions. I think that big data platforms already make a lot of use of metadata, and individual data is very often aggregated data. So very often you don't need individual personal data to make user profiling, tracking, and other things happen. Whether their business can survive that way is a question of, let's give it a try, I would say. The question with metadata is still that metadata can also be used for surveillance purposes. So even if you only use metadata and don't use your ID, your name, or your geographic location, many inferences can be drawn. So there is a lot of discussion now about the so-called group privacy, because data can be used to stratify users, to stratify customers, to really identify the most lucrative customers and give them some preferences, for instance, in terms of credit rating. And we should not forget the lower part of this data stratification. So I think metadata is an interesting concept, but metadata can also be harmful and can be dangerous.
Good. Yes, I think metadata is not the magic solution, but a partial solution.
Partial.
Another question from Radha Krishnan. Can the data location strategy ever work? Because big tech and powerful countries can put pressure, and then the smaller players have to buckle down. India seems to have done a U-turn in regard to data location strategy. She has noted that in the new draft bill, there is this concept of trusted geographies and so on. So I think that's what she's referring to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also noted about this U-turn, or about the missing concept of data localization in the recent draft. And I'm not sure. I think this is also a question at WTO. It's not a question for big tech only. I mean, the question is whether it's really about data localization, which would be the success, but control over data. And of course, you might remember the Snowden revelations. So Europe is also very concerned about data flowing to the US, being stored in data centers in the US, because data can be intercepted and by the National Security Agency in the US as well. National security issues are one thing, commercial interests are the other thing. I think India is a large user base, and it might become even more important in the next decade to come. So I think India can confront big tech in setting its own standards, because I think all those GAFAM platforms want to be on the Indian market. So I think India shouldn't underestimate its own powers to set the rules. That would be my answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other point is that the physical location of where the data is stored is not perhaps the most important one, because you can have servers located in India which are weakly protected. And on the other hand, you can have servers located in another country which are very well protected. So the physical location of the server is only one factor. I think what matters more is who controls it and how secure it is.
Exactly. I mean, in Europe, you might know, in Europe, we had an agreement about data flows between Europe and the US. We first had the so-called safe harbor agreement, which was taken down by the European Court of Justice. Then we had the so-called Privacy Shield agreement, which was also nullified by the European Court of Justice. So I think these data protection adequacy requirements may also play a role in the interaction between Europe and India, but also India might set its own data adequacy or data protection adequacy requirements, as has been spelled out a little bit in this new draft on data protection. So I think identify countries with whom you want to exchange data, you want data exchanges to happen, and identify other countries where you say, no, this is not, this is possibly too risky for us. I think this is another way of controlling data or trying to control the flows of data. Okay. And of course, in the WTO domain, a term has been coined free flow of data with trust. It's a very general term which needs to be more concretized, but at least it's not just free flow of data, but also setting certain principles, setting certain restrictions, which might be more protective of privacy, but also national interest.
Okay, there's a similar question from PVG Menon. He says, in your opinion, is the debate on data localization following the so-called deglobalization or nearshoring debate taking place globally after the pandemic, just as countries are trying to build local capacity for manufacturing, is the move to build local capacity for storing data on the same trajectory? So
I'm not sure whether this is already a trend. At least I can tell you from Europe. Europe is trying to build its own cloud, which is a cloud which is called Gaia X. So in that respect, I think India and other countries might also try to have their own data centers in their own countries, and might also incite companies to store the data in local data centers, which could be another strategy. I'm not sure. There is a lot of discussion about offshoring and onshoring of jobs, but also of data practices. So I think there is not a clear trend and clear move, but at least I think there are more let's say, attempts at least to really have data centers stored in the country where the data is extracted. So I think this is a strategy which might be useful, But it's not just, as you have said, Dr. Balakrishnan, it's not the location, but how data is dealt with and the measures taken to protect the data, but also to make sure how it is used and that it's used in a beneficial way.
Thank you. I think we'll end the Q&A session here. You know, there was a comment that India becoming a data superpower. I think for India, you know, we want to use this whole technology for development. We want to make it inclusive, within reach of everyone, however educated or non-educated the person may be. So it's not that the objective is to become some kind of a superpower. It's the objective is to use the data in a very complex society like us, a multicultural, multilingual society, which is a developing economy, with the coexistence of technologies ranging from the bullock cart age to the 21st century. So there is no other society like India in the world where you have this combination of advanced digital technology as well as the whole range of technologies across development spectrum. So it's a fascinating, challenging, and I think it's a great adventure we have in India to find our own way of managing data security and managing digital governance. So I think with these words, I'll hand over. Who's giving the vote of thanks?
I'll give.
Okay, over to you, Dr. Sneha, for the vote of thanks.
Very good afternoon, good evening, good morning. As we join from different parts of the world, there are many international participants today. On behalf of RIS, first and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General RIS, for his constant support and guidance. I also express my sincere thanks to Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan for excellently convening the session. Thank you, Dr. Krishna Ravi Srinivas, for your welcome remarks. I'm extremely thankful to the speaker, Professor Ingrid Schneider, for an enlightening lecture and discussions on several issues of digital sovereignty and data governance. Thank you, Mr. Sunit Tandon, Director, IHC, and our other partner institutions, TERI, CEFIPRA, and Vigyan Prasar. Most importantly, a big thank you to the IT team at RIS for their technical support. Thank you all once again. Thanks to all attendees for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and goodbye.